Friday, December the 12th. It's Common Sense for the American People. Scott Jennings is here on the Salem Radio Network. As always, the Scott Jennings Show is sponsored by Ease Total Health. Health insurance is broken, and Ease fixes it with no deductibles, no red tape, and real benefits from day one. Visit easeforeveryone.com/Scott. And while I'm at it, regarding Ease, this health insurance business, it's in the news. It's what they're debating up in Congress right now. We got the end of the year thing coming up. The health insurance situation is a complete and total mess, but I have some good news about health care, and I'll share it with you now. Ease Total Health, it could be the answer for you. It's not traditional insurance. It's better than that. It's a set of benefits that you and your family can use from day one. There's no deductibles, no restrictions on what doctors or hospitals you can choose. There's a range of options. Do yourself a favor. Go to easeforeveryone.com/Scott. Call them up, 888-EASE-123. Check it out. Don't wait for the government or insurance companies to help you. They won't. Go to easeforeveryone.com/Scott or call 888-EASE-123. Really interesting show today. We're going to have a debate. I was recently invited to the Buckley Institute at Yale University to debate a friend of mine named Noah Rothman from National Review. And the question is Donald Trump's agenda conservative? We debate. You decide right here on the Salem Radio Network.
My view is that the Trump agenda and the Trump presidency can be fairly judged as being conservative. That's not to say that he hasn't occasionally done things that most of us wouldn't regard as not conservative. But on the whole, it would be hard to argue otherwise, in my opinion. We'll begin with a little common sense. For decades, the conservative movement made promises that it sometimes did not deliver on. Judges that were faithful to the Constitution, deregulation, a strong America, a humming economy, an end to endless wars, a government that put Americans ahead of globalist theories, and for decades, some of these theories gathered dust on white papers at think tanks while the left pillaged and took over every institution in America. Then Donald Trump showed up. And for all the hand-wringing about his personal style, he actually did the things that we all said we wanted to do. First, the courts. Barrett, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, the most consequential judicial trio in modern history. Their jurisprudence restored the Constitution to the center of American law. And yes, that includes the decision that finally overturned Roe v. Wade, something we had promised for 50 years, but could not achieve until the presidency of Donald Trump. Turns out you have to put the right people in the right seats to get the outcomes that you want. You don't have to like his social media to acknowledge that he delivered on the most important conservative policy victory in a half a century. Second, the economy. And I know we'll have some debates about economic theory here tonight. In his first term, he in fact unleashed a roaring economy by cutting taxes, by cutting regulations, by expanding energy production, and yes, by standing up to China. These were not moderate or centrist positions. They were unapologetically conservative positions. And in his second term, the tax cuts had been made permanent. Before the pandemic, America had its lowest unemployment in 50 years, including historic unemployment lows for African Americans and Hispanic workers. Wages were rising, middle-class optimism was rising, and benefits were flowing to broadly middle America, the working class of America that has more and more lately described itself as conservative. Third, foreign policy. Conservatives have long said that peace is achieved through strength, not weakness, not apology tours, not lectures from Foggy Bottom. Trump rebuilt and will soon rearm a hollowed-out military. He has confronted China. He defeated the ISIS caliphate. He moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He brokered the Abraham Accords and will soon see their historic expansion. He kept the United States out of new quagmires. Some people are currently complaining about the Trump doctrine in our hemisphere, but I think most Americans would agree it's conservative to keep deadly drugs out of our country. The results speak louder than any words or speeches ever could. And regarding foreign policy, perhaps the most important thing that he has done since coming onto the scene, whether he intended to or not, or whether he knew that he was stepping into this role or not, Donald Trump has become the #1 conservationist of the future of Western civilization. Administrative state. Conservatives have always warned about Washington's unelected bureaucracy, that it is the greatest threat to self-government. Trump did not just warn about it, he exposed it. He took on permanent government institutions and people that have frustrated all of us for generations. He stripped away federal regulations more than any president in history. And he reminded us and made it a central part of our argument and operating theory that government works for the people, not the other way around. Finally, cultural clarity. Part of conservatism, in my opinion, is cultural confidence, the belief that America is good, that Western civilization is worth defending, and that common sense should be a key part of our ideology in every decision. The president shattered the left's monopoly on elite discourse. His presidency and his agenda represent the end of political pablum, the death of political pablum. Thank God, when you're a political consultant like I am, the pablum often becomes too much, and the president has absolutely murdered it to death. But he's made it permissible, again, to speak plainly about borders, about crime, about national identity, and about American patriotism in a culture that was lurching towards constantly apologizing for America and teaching our children that perhaps the American experiment was not a great idea. For many Americans, he has simply restored our confidence in saying what's on our mind or what everyone else is already thinking. Now, some people will say, MAGA and the Republicans are currently divided. You have supporters that are mad at him about immigration policy or foreign policy or economic policy. But big tent conservatism has always included people who didn't agree on every single thing. You had libertarians in there. You had national security hawks in there. You had some populists in there, evangelicals, suburban business types. The question isn't whether everyone agrees on every single plank. The question is whether the core of the agenda broadly represents conservative principles. My argument today is that Trump's agenda did, the results did. The coalition, which is larger and more working class than any coalition in the history of the Republican Party, certainly since Reagan, proves it. So if conservatism means originalism, constitutionalism, a strong America, secure borders, growing paychecks, deregulation, lower taxes, energy abundance, a restrained administrative state, and unapologetic Western values, in my opinion, this is not even a close call. The Trump agenda and the Trump presidency wasn't just conservative, it has been transformational. It has delivered what conservative elites had promised for decades, yet often had trouble producing. It was conservative success through common sense execution that refused to be hemmed in by old arrangements. So the resolution is not just affirmed, it is embedded in the record, written into the judiciary, and felt in the lives of millions of Americans. My resolution is that, yes, the Trump agenda is conservative. Thank you for having me here this evening.
The Jennings-Rothman debate over Donald Trump continues right after this. Don't miss it. Common Sense here on the Salem Radio Network. Friday, December the 12th, Common Sense for the American People. Scott Jennings here on the Salem Radio Network. I'm bringing to you today this debate that I had at Yale University at the Buckley Institute with my friend Noah Rothman, who writes for National Review. You've heard him on the show before. The proposition put before us was, is Donald Trump's agenda conservative? I was asked to take the yes, and Noah Rothman took the dissenting opinion. At the beginning of the show, you heard my opening statements, and right now you're going to hear Noah Rothman from the National Review take the other side. It's the Rothman-Jennings debate at Yale. We continue now here on the Scott Jennings Show on the Salem Radio Network.
Trump's approach represents a repudiation of the fundamental conservative supposition that central economic planning does not work. What we now euphemistically refer to as industrial policy is command economics with Trumpian characteristics. At its foundation is the Obama-like supposition that government should be in the business of nudging private actors into behaving as Washington wants them to. It is therefore unsurprising that we've seen Trump's subordinates sometimes sound like left-wing degrowthers. Access to cheap goods is not the essence of the American dream, said Scott Bessent. It was his improvisatory reaction to his understanding that the president's policies would truncate America's opportunity and limit the disposable income to which they would otherwise have access. But in essence, this is necessary, they tell themselves, because we must impose this hardship on Americans if we're to realize some centrally planned vision of what the economy should look like, how Americans should be spending their time, even if that time is spent, quote, screwing in little screws into iPhones, in Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's words. Far beyond any reasonable compromise with the demands associated with national security, the Trump administration has taken stakes in private enterprises like NVIDIA, which is now forced to fork over a 15% VIG on the profits it derives from the formerly restricted sale of sensitive electronic components to our Chinese adversaries. It's done something similar with Advanced Microdynamics and Intel, U.S. Steel, and Lithium Americas Corporation. Those of us with living memory of the Obama years have little excuse for failing to call this what we called it at the time, gangster government. And sometimes it manifests in prescriptions for more state control over private affairs. Take, for example, lifelong Democrat and Trump's Health and Human Services Secretary, RFK Jr. If RFK had his way, Americans would be constrained for their own goods. They would encounter far less artificial food coloring, following the example of bastions of liberty like the European Union and California. Americans would be spared access to fluoridated water and fluoride supplements in over-the-counter pharmacies. They would also have less sugar, but only if they're poor. Arming Americans with knowledge about what they're consuming is not enough. Without the mandatory guidance of an enlightened bureaucrat, the public will devour antidepressants by the fistful and subsist on a diet of empty carbs. How condescending. How paranoid. Indeed, elsewhere in the realm of foreign policy, we've seen the president adopt some of the blinkered conceits that were native to Barack Obama, a president who wanted to see America occupy a much smaller place in the world. Trump himself may not regard America as a spent force that should retreat into its own hemisphere, but some of his subordinates do. Fundamentally, we lack the capacity to manufacture the amount of weapons Ukraine needs us to supply, J.D. Vance wrote last year in an op-ed explaining why the United States should voluntarily cede to Moscow a sphere of influence in Europe it could not otherwise secure for itself. The conservative right has long argued that America's partners should take on a larger role in their own defense, but only to be active stewards of the American national interest as defined by the American president. Republicans especially should understand that if we merely lead from behind, Europe will not stand up to our shared adversaries. But the president's attitudes, as Scott said, are changing. In his speech before the Knesset, the president praised his own willingness to neutralize Iran's nuclear program and let our Israeli allies loose in ways that offend the peace processors, the multilateralists, the self-defined restrainers. Trump hailed his own abilities to open up new diplomatic avenues through the application of force, and he was right to do so, even if his successes speak for themselves. And that's the dirty secret of Trump's first term, that the biggest and most lasting policy successes were outgrowths of conventional conservative policy prescriptions. Armed with gigantic chips on their shoulders, functionaries within the second Trump administration seem to have set out with the goal of repudiating the first. It's no surprise, then, that some of these policies have a distinctly left-wing flavor. I am pleased by the president's political evolution, and I hope it continues apace. But hope is not a strategy. We are obliged to give voice to our pangs of conscience, even at the risk of our own political position, because there is no political position worth occupying if it compels us to sacrifice our principles upon the altar of political relevance. Thank you.
That voice you're hearing, Noah Rothman from National Review, he was my debating opponent. We were invited to Yale University recently by the Buckley Institute to answer the question, is Donald Trump's agenda considered conservative? In the opening of the show, you heard me argue for yes. You heard Noah Rothman's rebuttal. When we come back, the questions and answers will begin. We'll tackle a lot of topics. It's a really interesting debate, and I did it with a good friend, and I'm happy to present it to you today. It's common sense for the American people. The Rothman-Jennings debate at Yale continues after this on the Salem Radio Network. Welcome back to the Scott Jennings Show here on the Salem Radio Network. It is Friday, December the 12th, and you're listening to a special edition of the show, the Rothman-Jennings debate at Yale over the Trump agenda. We'll continue that in just a moment, but I did want to say to you, once again, Christmas is coming, and we are in the middle of our Angel Tree Christmas campaign. I want to thank everyone who's already joined. We've had hundreds of people joining this week. I did it myself. I would never ask you to do something that I wouldn't do. I made a personal donation to the Angel Tree campaign because I believe in helping these children. These little kids, they have a mom or a dad in prison. You can bring the joy of Christmas to these kids. You know, they have a lot of uncertainty in their lives. You can brighten their lives this Christmas by donating $30. I want you to listen to one of the kids, Joseph. He was blessed by donations from people just like you.
I will write to my dad about what happened. And one Christmas gift I got from Angel Tree was a drawing pad. That was my favorite I got. I also got paint and colored pencils. I knew he knew what I wanted, and he got the right thing. My name's Joseph, and I love Angel Tree.
My website is scottjenningsshow.com. That's where you go to make a donation. For the Angel Tree banner, you just look at the top of the screen. You click it. You could have this done in less than 60 seconds. If you'd rather, you could call them up, 888-206-2793. ScottJenningsShow.com, that's a good way to do it. Or call 888-206-2793. Help these little ones, little kids, their mom and dad are in prison. It's Christmas time. You have big hearts. Let's help them out. And let's get back to the debate. Rothman v. Jennings here on the Salem Radio Network.
Well, I don't disagree with my sparring partner here that the president has had some dalliances that we would all agree wouldn't be traditionally conservative. That's absolutely true, and I don't think he would dispute that either. I actually interviewed the president recently, and I asked him, does he consider himself to be more of a conservative, or if he leans more heavily into the branding that he's applied to his party, which is common sense. And he said, well, I'm most of the time conservative is common sense, and so he thinks of his decision making as conservative, but you can tell, he said most of the time. And so he's not necessarily hemmed in by the idea that he must operate within an ideological framework outside of what he's laid out broadly as his theory, which is simply, I'm just going to do what's common sense and what's in the best interest of America. I think judging these presidents, and I worked for one who I think we would all agree was broadly conservative, George W. Bush. He had his dalliances with non-conservative ideas as well on numerous occasions, and things I certainly am chagrined about to this day. Campaign finance reform, and so I guess some of the questions we have to answer when we debate these matters is how much ideological purity do you expect out of your Republican presidents, and how much latitude are you willing to give them for tactical movements that are politically required in the moment or that match the coalition that they've built. And I'll just end with this, Noah, which is that the president has built a coalition that is extraordinarily strange. It's large, but it's strange. We now exist in a political party that contains RFK Jr., Mitch McConnell, Rand Paul, Jillian Michaels, and Donald Trump. It's a strange coalition, and often tactically operating within a broad coalition like that, as most successful presidents do, means you occasionally wind up doing things that will be considered ideologically impure but tactically sound in the moment.
Yeah, that's a point I attempted to make in the speech, is that there's tactical accommodations that must be made with political realities. We should say at the outset that it is an apples and oranges comparison if we're talking about the Republican Party's electoral coalition and the ideological coalition of the conservative movement. These are just two completely distinct things. But yes, I'm curious if you think that the president has undergone some sort of a political evolution there, because in his first term, he would describe himself as a pragmatist. And he faced a lot of criticism from doctrinaire conservatives. And he would say, this is not the conservative party. This is the Republican Party. I'm running as a Republican. I'm not running as a conservative. Presumably, my assessment there is that he was frustrated with his critics and was attempting to put his critics in their place, not necessarily to make an ideological statement. But the departures from conservative ideological prescriptions in policy seem to me to be motivated by pragmatism. And you can make the argument, though it's not a dispensation the MAGA types would ever give Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan had to work with the Democratic Congress, the apostasy is unforgivable. For some reason, Donald Trump gets special dispensation. But it's rarely, in my view, that he's navigating thorny political landscapes when he does that he's seeking the path of least resistance at times when he doesn't necessarily have to, when he could mount a fight if he were so inclined, but chooses not to.
Oh, well, I think he is an in the moment counterpuncher. You know, my observations of him have changed somewhat this year, to be candid, because I've spent some time with him. I have a book coming out Tuesday, and it caused me to spend some time with him. And
plug it.
Yeah. It's called A Revolution of Common Sense, and and Noah and I will now pause for you to pull out your phones and order it. No, really, we will not continue until
we will not resume until you do so.
But he's a counterpuncher, and I think that is applied both to policy and politics and in the moment media and political relations. You know, he reacts to things in the moment, and things are always in motion. That's the one thing I really learned about him this year, is that things are constantly in motion. Sometimes put in motion by other actors, sometimes put in motion by him, or sometimes both. But because things are constantly in motion, he's prone to constantly being willing to change his direction, to zig when they think he's going to zag, or to return to a topic that people had thought had been put to bed. And so, you know, strictly speaking, you know, if you were a conservative and you were operating from a purely ideological perspective, you would sort of set course and let it ride. That's just not his theory at all. He is constantly willing to make adjustments or trim the sails or move in a different direction if he think in the moment it's tactically or politically beneficial. And I don't actually think he thinks that much about, well, if I do that movement, is it going to be considered a betrayal of conservatism? What he is thinking is, if I don't make this moment, I am not going to win this particular exchange. Now, obviously, the area where he, I think, most obviously departs from the movement is on the tariff issue, which you raised. And having spent some time with him, and we've all listened to his public statements, he is never, ever, 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 ever going to change his mind about this. And if and when the Supreme Court, which sounds like a strong possibility, chucks this out, he is going to be apoplectic, and he won't be thinking too much about conservatism or progressivism. He'll just be thinking that, in his opinion, the number one tool of the presidency is the power to tariff. And it's not just an economic tool, it's a national security tool and a diplomatic tool. But on that, he firmly does not subscribe to the ideological constructs.
Well, listen, I don't think it takes much for us to forecast what his reaction would be, and I'm actually very trepidatious about it. When the court goes against him, as it did on this tariff, signaling how they're going to rule next term, he called Leonard Leo a sleazebag who probably hates America. That's a Federalist Society. This is the bench that we're all grateful for. And yes, when they delivered Dobbs, that we're profoundly and deeply grateful for this president and how he's shaped the court. But then when they say, okay, you can't actually change the EPA like you want to because that's Congress's domain. Not a policy I like, but certainly congressional supremacy I like. When they say, you know, they shut down the tariffs, when they say that you're actually not at war with Venezuela, as much as you're kind of trying to create this political fiction, the courts are deaf to it, that's a conservative jurisprudence. And when the president, as I anticipate he will, goes after his own justices, goes after the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, which is already suffering, merely to prop up his own political position, he's doing what you said he does, which is win an argument in the moment, heedless of how the fallout will settle around the American Republic eventually. And that's not conservative.
I'll just quibble with one point about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. I think the legitimacy of the Supreme Court is suffering not because of anything a conservative or Donald Trump or any Republican has done. I think it's suffering because the American left is dedicated to destroying its legitimacy and its political arguments every single day. Now, if he adds to that, if he gets a ruling on this that he doesn't like, that would be unfortunate. But I think the legitimacy crisis in the courts is almost entirely confined to the arguments made by the left and what they intend to do to the court if they ever regain power. But I can just attest that he will be apoplectic, and I don't know exactly what he'll say or what he'll do, but it won't be attached to any fruit basket, I can assure you.
Scott, you seem to be making the case that tariffs are both a tool of economic policy as well as national security. I'd like to hear a little bit more on the national security side from you.
He believes that the tool is not merely for economic purposes. He believes the power to tariff is a tool of diplomacy and a tool of national security. And furthermore, he believes that this power has led him to be able to solve half of the conflicts that he has solved around the world. And so in his opinion, this tool is much broader than just having a debate about your ideological views on the American economy. I personally think in his heart of hearts, if given his druthers, we would go back to a world where only tariffs were driving federal revenue. There was no income tax. There was no IRS. It would simply be a tariff-based economy, and we take out all of the federal bureaucracy around personal taxation. And he might argue that that actually is a conservative view, that we would take taxes away from the people. But that is his worldview, and it obviously is a deviation from what we have operated on for a very long time.
But the notion that we could retreat to a 19th century conception of what the federal government looks like, I'd be happy with the size of that federal government. I would not be happy with the abdication of the responsibilities that would necessarily accompany that truncation of the federal government, so that it could live on, it could be, small enough to drown in a bathtub, just completely underfunded at that point. And again, maybe that would work, but let's just retreat to the national security rationale around tariffs, which has been, in my view, abused. To the point at which, because there is a national security rationale for tariffs, although it should be very sparing, because any trade war is not a metaphor. War is the last resort when it comes to policy, because you are inviting damage that you're willing to absorb to a certain point in order to affect an outcome from an adversary. A trade war is like any other war in that sense. You're inviting damage and that you're willing to shoulder in order to change and shape the international environment. But these are not national security tariffs. They're designed, and in their more honest moments, the Trump administration's functionaries will say as much, subordinates, appointees, and other officials within the Trump administration, that it is designed to reshape the economy in ways that are desirable to the Trump administration.
That voice you're hearing there, Noah Rothman from the National Review, and you've been listening to this special debate, Rothman versus Jennings, debating the idea, is Donald Trump's agenda conservative? I said yes. Rothman said no. And that exchange right there was really good. In the hall that night at Yale, people were absolutely loving it, which is why I'm bringing it to you today on the show. We're going to have closing arguments when we come back. Rothman v. Jennings over Trump and conservatism. It's been an honor to bring this to you, and we draw it to a close when we come back. It's common sense for the American people. Thank you so much for listening. This is Scott Jennings on the Salem Radio Network. Okay, we're wrapping up here on Friday, December the 12th. It's Scott Jennings on the Salem Radio Network. It's a special edition of the show I'm presenting to you today. This debate that I had with Noah Rothman from National Review. We were invited to Yale University by the Buckley Institute, and I have to say, thank you to R.J. Hakes, who's the director of programs, Mo Graviot, who's part of the team there, and also the moderator. You've heard his voice, Owen Tillman. It was a great team at the Buckley Institute. We had a great crowd that night. They were really into the debate. And I told Noah that night, this is going to be amazing. I got to put this on the radio because we've had such an interesting exchange. The question, of course, was, is Donald Trump's agenda conservative? And they asked me to take the yes, and Noah took the no. And it was, I respect Noah, and of course I read him all the time. So it was an honor to be there with him. And I'm really glad to present the closing arguments to you. Rothman v. Jennings, the Yale Buckley Institute debate. It wraps now here on the Scott Jennings Show on the Salem Radio Network.
Thank you all for your time and your moderation tonight. I wanted to ask, one of the core tenets, at least for me, about conservatism is the kind of moral teachings and the transcendent truths. And these seem broadly missing from the Trump administration. So I wanted to get you guys' opinion on how exactly the moral standing of the Trump administration has been, and in fact, if it is possible for a political leader such as Trump to have any kind of moral conservatism.
Well, I guess that's a very broad question. And I recall back in the first term being asked about the, relative morals of Donald Trump, and someone asked me to write a piece about why evangelical Christians and people for whom morals means a lot, why do they love Donald Trump so much? And my answer at the time was, we didn't hire him to sing soprano in the choir. We hired him to guard the church door, and the barbarians are at the gates. And in some places, they're inside the gates. And so I think that it is possible for someone who to run an administration who doesn't necessarily have the pedigree that you're alluding to in his own personal life, but to absolutely take actions that guard those that do, and that guard the values of those that do. And again, just as a political operative, I'm constantly looking at his actions in a dynamic setting where, what is the alternative here? And if you look at the cultural implications of his campaigns and his administration, the pushing back of the transgender cult, the pushing back against DEI, the pushing back against paper straws, all of the things that we would regard as cultural nonsense at best and extraordinarily corrosive at worst, he has been willing to have these fights every single time, and he has made it safe again for people who have values and have morals and engage in faith to pop their head up and speak their mind, when we were living in a world when every single person in this country felt like we had a wet blanket of this crap on top of us. He made it safe for government to do it, and he's made it safe for corporate America to shed all the garbage in which they were forced to engage. Some of them have, some of them haven't, but I would just argue for them it's fine to open the window and come out into the sunlight. And so I don't expect the president, and I don't expect Donald Trump to be a pastor. I don't expect him to give me counseling on morals. I don't expect him to do anything other than make it safe for people who want to live their lives by those tenets to do so. And there is no possible argument that he hasn't done that better than the alternative, and maybe better than anybody who's done it in the last 30 years.
I'm not a political operative. I'm an uncompromising ideological zealot. And I do not see the mutual exclusivity of effective executive and moral person, and somebody who doesn't treat individuals like instruments and tools to be used or discarded, who has some sense of the transcendent, and who doesn't behave like a bore and a lout in public. I don't think it's too much to ask.
And so concludes the epic Rothman v. Jennings Buckley Institute debate. It was an honor to go to Yale University, and I also want to thank from Yale and the Buckley team, Lauren Noble, the founder and executive director of the Buckley Institute. The whole team there couldn't have been better. Well-organized event and a great crowd, and I look forward to getting back up to Yale sometime in the near future. And thanks to Noah Rothman, my friend. We had a spirited exchange, And I'm sure we're going to see Noah back on the show. We had him on the other day. He's got a great book coming out about left-wing violence in America that I highly encourage you to pick up. That's all for today. I'm traveling in Michigan. The Revolution of Common Sense book tour continues. I've been on the road all week. The World Travels of Scott Jennings continues. I'm meeting folks on the road. We're doing radio. We're selling books. And we're saving Western civilization. See you Monday. It's Scott Jennings here on the Salem Radio Network.